as the saw world turns. Cautiously optimistic I know what killed this saw. Check that out. See that kinked fuel line? That would kind of make it want to run lean, right? Of course, auto-tune will try to tune around as best it can, but there's limitations. And let me see if I can get a shot at what it looks like inside. You can get a glimmer, but basically it's toast. So we have a project. Well, this one here is going to be the first of a couple of projects that we're going to do today. And it already has some video-worthy stuff about it, you know? This guy really wants me to build this into that 372 XPW build, and it's an X-Torq, at least it was. So I was like, you know, I don't know if this guy's going to be really impressed with just you know, one of my typical XPW builds. You know, they're not like these huge differences. They're usually just a little bit more torquey. It's not like a modded saw or anything. Then I saw this cylinder, and I just have this sneaking suspicion that this guy's going to be impressed. We'll get it out of there. It says Meteor. It's a Meteor top end. And it's an X-Torq Meteor top end. Actually, it doesn't look that bad. Well, look at that. If you look inside, see how it's got the fin? I don't know if you can see it with the camera. It's got the fin in there like a 365, so it has a reduced cross-sectional area on the transfers on this Meteor cylinder. One of those opportunity lost type things. The guy actually spent money for that top end and had it put on there for the kind of money that he could have had a real legitimate cylinder. If you look, that crank has seen some trauma before. And I mean, it's probably alright, but I don't like what I'm looking at right there. It looks like it's spun inside bearings. So my hunch is that somebody's already replaced the bearings in here once. And the question is, did they do it in such a fashion where I can salvage these things? Or did this come all the way apart and someone put in the new bearings that are OEM and do it the brutal way, which oftentimes ruins the cases. Either way, we're into it now, so I might as well just pull the seals and then start from scratch and start cleaning these cases up and building them. It's a shame to waste a good seal like that, but you know. Oh boy. Yeah, see, this is a hack job. See, this is the problem. It's hard to see, but they beat up this case right here, so I don't know if I'm ever going to get it to seal. That makes me nervous. I guess we just do the best we can, right? I think I'm going to go SKF this time. That's what this one's going to get. And just see how they last. Yeah, and you guys have seen this a gazillion times. So, what I kind of like to do with these is to basically get the cases heated to the point where they just about drop out. You know, it's not a big strain or pain to get those out of there. Here we go. Just set right in there. I'll get a heat sink on there and chill it down. This saw looks to me like it's had some attention before. I'm not the first person in this saw, by any stretch of the imagination. This is I think, a very practical build. That's for any version of the 372, not just the X-Torqs. I put the ground wire on the bottom. Does it really matter? Probably not. But I'd rather have the ground wire bounce off that spring, which should be isolated, but who knows. And this one here also is going to go to pretty much a full-time logger. Boy, look at all this junk. This build that I'm doing is an X-Torq to an original edition XPW top end, right? And I noticed that online there was some commentary about that, and it just seems to me like it's one of those things that people just get confused. So this whole build started as an X-Torq, 372 X-Torq, and they came on the market around 2010. The 372 original edition, when it came out in the 90s, actually it came out as a 371, pretty much elevated the bar for 70cc saws, and it was very hard for Husqvarna to obsolete that whole class of saw. And the first attempt was the 575, and that was a miserable failure. It was kind of big and heavy, had some teething issues. And the subsequent 576 pretty much suffered guilt by association because it was derived from the 575. Husqvarna found themselves in a dilemma. People really wanted the 372, but they couldn't bring it back to the market as it originally was for a variety of reasons. 372 X-Torq was the answer. In my mind, the 372 X-Torq is a radically different design than the original 372, and it gets me in a little bit of hot water at times when I argue with my friends. But I'm going to make the case here, but also, while I'm doing that, I'm going to cover a lot of the evolution of that 371 to 372 X-Torq along the way. The 371 came out in the 90s and very quickly turned into a 372. Now this is a 372 original edition case, and there's a few differences between the original edition cases and the X-Torq cases, but there was also some differences between the 371 cases and the 372. This stiffening rib right here showed up in the 372. If you find some of the early 371s, that's not there. While I'm talking about the differences between the 371 and 372, another difference was the pistons. The 371 had a single ring piston, and somewhere along the way they changed them over to double ring pistons. The cases, once they got into that 372 original edition configuration, stayed that way for quite some time. And then, I guess when they started conceptualizing the X-Torq, they had to make some changes. The biggest difference between the 372 original edition set of cases and the 372 X-Torqs is right in here. They had to add some depth to that recess and a little bit of meat in order to allow that depth to be had without weakening that flange. So if you were to look closely, you'll see this original edition has not quite as deep a recess and a little bit less material. Now here's the deal. I can take an original edition top end and pretty much all the components and put it back on these X-Torq cases. But I cannot take an X-Torq top end and put it on original edition cases because, I don't know if you can see it, but there's almost 40 thousandths interference right there, where the same cylinder on the case it was designed for sits right in there. That recess is the primary difference between the original edition cases and the X-Torq cases. I'm not going to get into painful detail. I'm just going to brush over the biggest differences. Now, in the original edition 372s, or that class of saw, there was two models that was offered, and then there was a lower cost model. First, the 365, which was the lower cost saw on that same set of cases, had the same crank and cases and a lot of the other parts. In the 372xp, there was a fairly significant difference in the cylinders. First, the 365 is a 48 millimeter cylinder, and the 372 is a 50 millimeter cylinder. In addition to the difference in bore, 48 versus 50, 48 for the 365, 50 for the 372, there's a fairly significant difference in the cross-sectional area of the transfer ports. Now, not to get into porting theory, but the cross-sectional area of the transfers has a lot to do with what RPM that saw wants to run. When you do a no-load tune on the 372, that's sort of a reference RPM to figure out whether or not you got the tuning correct. The 372 original edition 50 millimeter version, the no-load was about 13.5, and the 365 was around 12.5. So there was a significant difference in the RPMs that these two cylinders were designed to run. And your clue is, again, the cross-sectional area of those transfer ports. Now hold that thought. Another version of the 372 that was offered was an XPW. Now if you look, you can see that that wall is quite a bit thinner on the XPW than it is the XP. So it has a larger diameter. It was 51.4 millimeters versus the 50 millimeters on the standard 372 XP. But if you look at those transfers, they actually filled in some material on that transfer port, so you have less cross-sectional area on the XPW cylinder than the standard 50 millimeter XP. So what's that tell you? It tells you this cylinder was designed to run at a lower RPM. So it had a larger displacement, but it also wanted to run at a little bit lower RPM. There's a reason why I'm bringing this up. And if you kind of look, it sort of splits the difference in area between the 365 and the 372, which has quite a bit more. And of course, the 50 millimeter 372 original edition is a screaming saw. And part of the reason is those transfers. All right. So you have 365, 48 millimeter, smallest of the transfer cross-sectional areas, but also wants to run at the lowest RPMs. The 372 standard XP with a 50 millimeter large transfer cross-sectional area makes its best power at a higher RPM. And then the 372 XPW, which has a 51.4 millimeter bore, and it also has a smaller cross-sectional area, so again wants to bring the RPMs down. Now I'm bringing that up because that relates to the build we're doing with the X-Torq. Now, the X-Torq, and we've gone through this, I've gone through this in more detail in other videos, so I'm really not going to dwell on it if I can help it. The X-Torq is a completely different design, and I don't care how you cut it. I mean, the entire cylinder is different in just all kinds of ways. Number one, it's heavier because it's bigger. It's a lot more metal in that X-Torq cylinder than the standard 372. So the saw is going to be heavier. But also, since the cylinder is taller, the saw is going to be taller as well. So everything above the cylinder, like the top covers and the handle and the chain brake handle, are all going to be different on an X-Torq than the original edition. Well, I'm not sure where I left this. I ran out of battery, but I can do another video at another time to yet again go over the differences between the X-Torqs and the original editions. And where I'm going with the XPW build is simply this. With the smaller cross-sectional area of the transfers, it too likes to run at the same RPM range as the X-Torq cylinders. Here's an X-Torq. Because they do have roughly the same kind of cross-sectional area in the transfers. They like to run the same kinds of RPMs. That's not the only thing, but it is a major component of it. Now, what you get with this cylinder is an original edition feel, a little bit less weight, good power, is much or more power than the X-Torqs, and the simplicity and the reliability that you get with those original edition cylinders that don't have to deal with the raw air that these do. Now, I mean, they've got these where they're pretty reliable, don't get me wrong. And the other thing you get by taking this approach is you can use the ignition systems, which are rev limited to 13.3, and you can also still use the same carburetor, and I'll show you how to do that. The filter holder, carburetor, and intake boot have to pass the air from there across the top of the carburetor into these ports right here. And as I said before, the additional height of the cylinder is to accommodate that system. And this build is trying to use as much of the original X-Torq parts as possible, yet still get the benefits of the original Edition saw. That's where we're going. So I'm going to finish doing that. One thing I did forget to do, so I had to go back and correct it, is I had to pull that clutch off and put that little tiny O-ring that sits on the crankshaft underneath that sleeve where the oil pump worm gear rides on. I had to go back and pull that apart. Now I'm going to leave the ignition in this saw that was already on there. This is an older X-Torq, and it says right there 13.3. You can see what it was limited for. This saw was an early saw, but it has the later ignition system. Somebody had upgraded the ignition for some reason. I think I've got one in the drawer I can show you. Here's one. This is another one from an X-Torq, and this is one that has the 13.3 right on there. Boy, look at all the water in that gas. Wow. Looks like the diaphragms and stuff are fine, but looks like this saw right here was running on a steady diet of water. Diaphragm is fine. But like I said before, part of this whole build is trying to use as many of the X-Torq pieces as possible, yet end up with an original edition saw. And that means one that's a little bit lighter, a little bit simpler, a little bit easier to tune. The other approach is actually a legitimate one, and that's to gut. Well, obviously OEM is legitimate, otherwise it wouldn't be sold. But there are some issues systemic to the X-Torq concept, you know, and having to draw all that raw air in there. One of the approaches to making the X-Torqs easier to live with is simply upgrading to the later carburetor and ignition, you know. Husqvarna hasn't sat still on the design. There's product managers, and there's been development on that saw steadily all the way through to sort of work their way through some of the issues. Pistons are better. You don't see the bearing failures in the new ones. And the new X-Torq ignition has the ability of generating spark at a lower RPM. It tends to make it easier to start. So just things like that will make the new ones run better, but you can also retro back to the old ones. Alright, so let's start putting this stuff together. Can't forget that little ring. Well, this right here is the essence of the build, isn't it? Putting an OE top end on a X-Torq bottom end. And I did cover the difference in the cases and the cylinders and all that. And the two pieces of this puzzle, well, there's actually three pieces of the puzzle to make this an interesting build. One is going to a smaller and lighter cylinder that makes as much or more power. Two, using the same carburetor, the X-Torq Carb, and three, using the X-Torq ignition. Those three components. And of course the ignition is significant because those are rev limited to like a lower RPM than a standard 372. And these XPW top ends, made in Germany by the way, have smaller cross-sectional area in the transfers, so they like to run at that lower RPM. So pretty much everything kind of blends pretty well. And basically the difference between the carburetors is the orientation of the two mounting screws that are sort of twisted on the X-Torq carburetor, which is a slightly larger diameter. And that orientation is twisted, so what I did was cut the lug off of here, and I gutted the filter holder. And so we're going to take this original Edition style intake, put it on the original Edition style cylinder, and then rotate the carb and intake boot arrangement to the point where it's oriented properly. So if you look very closely, you're going to see plastic tubes on the inside, kind of like the original Edition carbs have. And I did that because on the X-Torq you have these little locating holes that are not going to be there on this particular build. So by putting those plastic sleeves in there, basically what I've done is been able to help stabilize the location of that carburetor, just the same way they did with the original Edition ones. For magic, like I always do. And that actually glues that intake on. It's a little bit overkill, and whoever has to tear this saw apart is going to hate me for it. Carburetor's going to have a little tilt to it, but that's just too bad. And then let me crank this down. But again, the essence of this build right here is starting out with an X-Torq, an older one, right? That's what this one was. This is a 2012 X-Torq. I put in the steel caged bearings, and so we built the bottom end up to what I think is a little better spec, and then used the ignition that came with it, because it works, and the carburetor, modified the intake boot for the original Edition cylinder versus the X-Torq cylinder. Put a XPW original Edition cylinder on this saw, and it doesn't want to rev as high as like a 50 millimeter standard original Edition 372 cylinder. So it likes that lower RPM, so it matches up with this ignition pretty well. And I don't know if you can tell, but this is one of the few that I've put on video, but I can tell you it's a strong build. Just like that, bolted, just standard stuff. I mean, the only thing non-standard about this is the goo gasket, you know, 1184 and the muffler mod. That's it. Everything else is pretty much bolt-on. And they make good power. There's no doubt that this is going to be a strong saw for this fella. Now, the things I don't like about this build, I would prefer the lower cover, you know, and that's as much about cooling as anything else, to force the air through the fins versus let it come up over the top. And I don't know how much of a difference it's going to make. We'll have to wait and see, let it run for a little bit and see. And that's about it. You know, if it was my saw, I would suggest putting the low top original Edition cover on it. That's about the only thing I do different than this. And it oils and it runs and it starts. It'll probably restart with one pull is my guess. And, you know, like that original Edition build, it'll be easy to tune, it'll be easy to get the idle. You know, there's a lot of things about the original Edition that are just easier to live with than the original cylinder that was on this saw. So, anyway. Other than tuning, I think that saw is pretty much done, don't you think?